Hey y'all, I wanted to come talk to you guys about the story that's been in the news lately about the right wing influencer who is making um, allegations about daycares run by Somali immigrants in Minnesota. And I want to talk to you about that because it has a whole bunch of hallmarks that suggest it's not going to stay there, right? It's not going to stay in Minnesota. It's not. It's also likely it's not going to stay focused on immigrants. And so um, I'm saying that because I'm really familiar with the history of the Satanic Panic. And when you look at the Satanic Panic and you look at this, they line up so closely that you have to kind of understand the opportunity that it presents for the far right, and most especially for the kind of Christian extremist, the kind of Christian white nationalist end of conservatism that has been driving so much of our politics for the last, decade. And so to talk about that, like we have to look at the fact that it's kind of centered on daycares. And when you go back and you look at the Satanic Panic, it becomes very clear what that was about in a larger sense. Yes, there was this whole narrative around Satanists and children being abused and those things. But the abuse of the children and the Satanists, that's the kind of motivator, right? That's the thing that gets people motivated to get behind this moral panic, this kind of witch hunt for, you know, something that didn't exist, and when you look at the Satanic Panic, it's very clear that it didn't actually need to exist. Like there was really no evidence behind the claims that were being made, and really very, very, very few people were saying that out loud. And the people who were saying that out loud weren't getting the kind of attention and time that the people kind of pushing and helping prop up the Satanic Panic were getting, right? You had not just the people who were making specific allegations, right? So you had specific allegations happening in different places in the country, targeting specific daycares and people in those daycares. But then you also had this kind of cottage industry that grew up around it, that was in support of all of that, talking about how to identify, if there might be satanic cults operating in your area and all of that. And like we're talking about like stuff that was being sold to the public school system, stuff that was being sold to like law enforcement was paying to have these quote unquote trainings, right? They're having seminars to teach their officers. The FBI is having its agents taught how to identify this thing that there was no evidence of. Like you have to understand that these claims were being made about these satanic cults, and nobody was able to find actual evidence of these cults existing, right? Even like at the time as it was happening, things like children making claims about having witnessed sacrifices of other children, having been subject to organ harvesting, and there's like no evidence of those things. Like nobody is able to produce bodies. Nobody is like these children who are saying they have been victims of evidence harming, of organ farming, organ harvesting. Like they have no scars. they're not presenting any physical symptoms or any, physical evidence of having been harmed at all. And, I'm not like, it's a very big subject. And you have to understand that at the time, what it turned out was happening was that the adults wanted to hear these allegations, and the kids were responding to that want, right? When you go back, like, it was people, even people who were like really well meaning, and like they just wanted to help the children. The way that they were going about talking to these kids and asking questions, they didn't really understand at the time how easily children could be led to give the answers that they think adults want to hear. Um, and so, excuse me, those were kind of the motivators for the Satanic Panic. But you have to understand that the goal of the Satanic Panic was something very different, right? It was something that, like, the reason they're using the Satanic Panic is because they don't actually want to describe their goals. They don't want to talk about what they are. And what they were at the time was the idea that they wanted to make it as hard as possible. They wanted to incur as much of a cost as possible for women, especially middle class women, to be going to work, right? Because if you look throughout history, one of the things that is kind of off, kind of not really totally accurate when we talk about this kind of recent past, poor women always worked. Like, they've always worked. It was a newer thing for middle class women to have access to both education and the workplace in the numbers that they were seeing at the time. And that, of course, is indirect challenge to the power base of this kind of conservative Christianity, because their real base of power, the way that they maintain it, is through the nuclear family, right? There's the nuclear family with the father at the head, the mother who's the he's at the head. He's kind of and the one who makes the rules, and he's the breadwinner and all of those things. And the mother, the woman, is the mother, right? She raises the children, she does the homemaking, she does all that domestic labor, right? And so what happened, like that threat of that domestic labor disappearing in those numbers is a really big threat to that kind of conservative Christianity. It's also a threat in that all of these women are getting educations, right? Because that tends to, we have seen, education tends to erode the kind of strict alignment with that degree of religiosity. So that's what the Satanic Panic is about. So it is, they create this fear of daycares so that all of these women who are going into the workplace are worried about sending their children to daycare. If you don't have childcare, you can't go to work, right? Clear. And the other way that works is that once this gets going, once the Satanic Panic gets going in the United States, it takes nothing, it takes very little, like the slightest accusation for one of those businesses, one of those daycare businesses, to be cratered. And there are, if you go back and you look at the history, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are convicted on false allegations. It turns out later on, when people start going back and looking at these cases, they're like, there was no evidence here. This was all conjecture, hearsay. It was like the moral panic itself was responsible for the convictions, right? It was because it was like on the news every day, all of that. And so you have to understand that the attack on the daycares was always about these gender roles and these gender norms and ensuring that it was harder for women to work, that it was incurring that much more of a cost for them. And so we're seeing now in Minnesota this little conservative grifter freak who decided to go say there's a bunch of fraud happening um, by by these daycares that are run primarily by some Somali immigrants. So that's relying on, right, these two previous narratives we've seen them use very often. Number one, the fraud, like government waste and fraud and all of those things. That's been very useful for them for the past decade and change, right? And then there's also the combination of the immigrant narratives that they've been using, and B, race, right? Because you think of Somali immigrants, the thing that comes to Americans' minds are people who are black, right? So that all factors into this, and they're relying on that, right? They're using that as the motivator, as opposed to, previously with the satanic panic, what they were using for the motivator was the threat against like children and the cultural sense that we had about, Satanism and all of that at the time. That was all that was all based on stuff that was already in the culture, right? There was the whole repressed memory thing that had happened like just before the satanic panic started, and it takes from that. And then there is the satanic ritual abuse thing that was super popular in like evangelical Christian circles, right? There's a guy named Mike Warnke who like really popularizes that in those circles. And then Michelle Remembers, the book comes out, and that is a much bigger, because it starts out, it is so successful within that evangelical space. The rest of the culture starts wondering, like, where did this book come from? Why is it selling so many copies? And then that catapults Michelle Remembers and that whole narrative about satanic ritual abuse into the mainstream, right? So everybody sees they can make some money off of this. And, it draws, ratings, all of that stuff. And so that again, you're talking about the motivator. And so now this motivator that they're using, right, is the immigrant narratives, the fraud and waste narratives, and the ever popular race narratives in the United States. So here's the thing: the Trump administration, the human health and human services already cut off funding for all of the daycares in Minnesota. Now, this little grifter, right? This little freak who started popularizing this story has made quite the name for himself, right? He is now very well recognized. How many more of them across the country do you think there are now going to be? So they will be going and doing, different versions of this same thing across the country. There's going to be plenty of people who are trying to get on that bandwagon and make themselves get themselves some attention, right? It is as easy as having a camera and asking some questions, right? So you can guarantee that's going to happen. And one of the things that has failed to really set in with a lot of people who consider themselves on the left is that the right will use absolutely any opportunity that is presented to them. This shutting down of funding to daycare centers in Minnesota, it's something that, it serves a couple of different purposes, right? Number one, that's Tim Walz is governor. Trump, not a fan of Tim Walz, right? Because Walz ran with Kamala Harris, and he had many accurate things to say about Trump. So, Trump is not into him. So you can hit Minnesota, and you're also giving, right, these Christian nationalists who are your main base of support something that they want, something that they've been waiting for years. They've been trying to get it, right? We can go back to the Satanic Panic in the 80s and see that this is something they've wanted the whole time. So do not write this off and do not take it lightly, because they will be coming for the funding for daycares nationwide the second they think there's the opportunity, right? And it doesn't even really have to be a good opportunity. You understand? There doesn't have to be evidence behind their claims. All they need is for it to get enough attention, right, from within their circles. And if you go and you start looking at what's going on Fox News, on Breitbart, on those kinds of sites right now, I ran a search a little while ago on Minnesota and daycares. The number of stories that are already going about that, it's ridiculous. So this is something to keep in mind, and it's also another one of those things that I'm talking about because it relates to the way that narrative works, right? We are always kind of dealing with past narratives that we're familiar with and that we have some relationship to, because they help give us a sense of context and a sense of understanding. But just because they are narratives we are familiar with doesn't mean that there's any actual factual accurate basis to them, right? And we are all of us are capable of falling for this kind of thing. So that's pretty much it. I mean, it ended up being a long video already, so I hope you all are having a good day.